The kind of guy you make any excuse to avoid getting into an elevator alone with. You know what I mean? Like, ugh. Hello, welcome to Sound and Fury Book Reviews. As usual, I am Tina. Today I'm doing a book review of That Time I Got Drunk and Saved a Demon by Kimberly Lemming. This is a book that came out a few years ago as a self-published book, and now I guess this series is being reprinted by Orbit. This one actually came out on January 2nd a couple days ago. It is a romance fantasy. I received this book on NetGalley in exchange for a fair review. I know. I just reviewed a romance on December 28th. Don't worry, this won't be a common thing. I just so happen to have been under the influence and on NetGalley and was like, haha, this will be funny and cute like Contagion. And I also wanted something light and easy to read around Christmas. I also didn't look at the release date, and so I was like, oh, I have to read this right away. So yeah, kind of a random thing that I just happened to do. As you know, once in a while I will read a romance book. Maybe, I think I read one or two last year. Anyway. Unfortunately, this novel did not work for me and is the perfect example of why romance generally isn't a genre I pick up unless under very specific conditions. I actually DNF'd this book at 60% because I was bored. The thing is, this book might work really, really well for others, so my critique here might actually help people decide to read it, which is my intention. I'm not here to tear the book down. As I've said many times on my channel, romance is a valid genre. I don't like when people think it's a stupid genre. That's not fair, and that's not cool with me. People need to read what they want to read, and this book in particular, I was not into, and I'm going to explain why, because I think that is fair. The first thing I wasn't really into is because the world building is incredibly light. We have a fantasy land populated by humans, and then every 15 years, demons escape from some realm. We're not really explained much beyond that, at least in the bit that I read. Maybe there was more of that later on. And we don't get much information about the demons as a culture, such as why there are different variants, including a werewolf. Why is a werewolf a demon? I don't understand. And etc. There's no discussion of how the world is set up globally or how trade routes work or anything like that. Of course, I don't expect, a high fantasy level of world building in a romance, but the world building was just way too light for me. I couldn't really picture kind of the world and how it functioned. The story was also predicated on a flimsy quest narrative, but that actually worked fine for me. This is also kind of besides the point, but I was also confused by mentions of cinnamon fields, as cinnamon is from the inner bark of a tree, so wouldn't it be orchards? I'm kind of confused because if this series was given a deal after being self-published, shouldn't these little nitty-gritty things have been addressed in editing? Sorry, Orbit, I love all your stuff. I don't know. I don't know about this one. I also can't stand when people in fantasy novels use modern language. I know this is just a pet peeve of mine. I don't even like it in movies, especially in movies. It drives me crazy. If they start talking like that in a movie, I'm like, no. In this regard, what I mean by this, though, is that, I don't mean informal speech and swearing, but using expressions from our world that don't make sense within the context of their world. It draws me right out of the story. The word sus, for example, was used. I mean, they spell it S-U-S-S instead, which I guess was a way to not make it so modern. But the context in which she uses it seems to fit the way young people use the expression as slang, which wouldn't have developed in a fantasy setting because doesn't that come from the Among Us game? Likewise, sus on its own means to suss out, as in to figure out. So how it was used in this novel also didn't make sense grammatically. Either way, that's just an example of anachronisms that you'll find in this novel, which, to be honest, irritated me. As I said, it's a preference thing, though. Some people might actually really enjoy that. I'm just explaining why it didn't work for me. The book is also all over the place tonally. Sometimes it's very light and funny, and sometimes an entire city is razed to the ground, and no one considers the innocents, kids, animals, etc. that actually died in the process. The narrative structure is whiplash-inducing in this way, and so I found myself hard to kind of get a bead on what the tone is supposed to be in the atmosphere. By far, though, and this is the last kind of critique thing I'll say, my biggest issue was with the love interest. I loathed him. I hated him. He was so incredibly disrespectful of her boundaries. He threatened her family, and his cockiness was through the roof. There was nothing likable about him, and he had the personality of that creepy guy at the bar who stares at your ass when you go to the bathroom and then catcalls you in the parking lot when you leave. The kind of guy you make any excuse to avoid getting into an elevator alone with. You know what I mean? Ugh. I have no idea why she was into him, aside from him being physically attractive, because she seems like a woman who doesn't take shit, and he's a pretty big asshole. There's no real banter in this novel to build up the sexual tension. In fact, the tension is all based on him leering at her constantly, and then being overly forceful about his attraction. There's a long passage where he describes all these sexual acts to her, but we're not given her reaction, just this long monologue. That was weird. In truth, I skimmed over it as it went on way too long. There is an extreme lack of consent as well in this book, and in fact, there's a disgusting line about how he tells her that she has no choice in the matter, implying that he knows her body more than she does. Not only that, but when love was brought in, I had to stop reading because I became exasperated. She can't stand the guy, so where does love come from? I understand her maybe having sex with him because he's attractive, but I don't think love had anything to do with any of the story before then. Anyway, even without the aforementioned sex stuff, he's just awful. He murders like thousands of people, and she deserves so much better. That leads me to one of the things I really did enjoy about the book, and that was Cinnamon herself. She was a fun character. You know, she's plucky, but she isn't an adventurous heroine, which was very different in a fantasy romance. I also loved how she was a person of color and curvy, which brings some much needed diversity into the genre. I loved that aspect. I thought the two competing innkeepers in the one city were very funny, and there was also a few scenes here and there that were really fun. In truth, I think I really enjoyed every scene where the main character Fallon was absent. I think I just hated him so much. If he'd been out of the story, I probably would have loved it and considered it like a cozy fantasy. Sin's family dynamic felt realistic and was very enjoyable to read too. Overall, this is definitely not my type of romance, if you can tell, but if you enjoy fantasy romance with non-human male characters, the alpha male trope, don't mind when consent isn't explicitly given in sexual situations, and enjoy some comedy, you will likely have a good time with this one. And yeah, feel free to go off in the comments and say that I'm too serious or I didn't understand the intent of the book, blah, blah, blah. I appreciate your opinion, and I'm glad that you have one, and I'm glad that you're reading books that you enjoy, and that's all that books should be. Just because I didn't enjoy this one doesn't mean I don't think that you can't enjoy it, because that's what reading should be. So yeah, thank you everyone for watching. I will be back with a sci-fi book next week, I promise. Thank you.